I never imagined that my life would become a surreal blend of porcelain and power, of silence and secrets. But it all began the day I walked into the towering glass building of Blackthorn Enterprises, where everything gleamed too perfectly, and everyone spoke like they were reading from a script written by money and molded by ambition. I had only applied for a basic assistant position, desperate after a string of misfortunes that had left me barely clinging to the ledge of stability. But from the moment I met Lucian Blackthorn, the enigmatic CEO with eyes like a frozen storm and a voice as smooth as silk-wrapped steel, something inside me shifted, like a doll's head clicking into place, and what began as a job quickly spiraled into something far stranger, darker, and more intoxicating than I could have ever foreseen. Because Lucian didn't just run his company with cold precision, he collected perfection, and not just in numbers or results, but in people, in appearances, in loyalty, so absolute it was almost frightening. And when he looked at me that first time, with an expression unreadable yet burning with some odd form of curiosity, I felt like I had been plucked off a shelf and inspected, like a toy someone might want to play with or possess. I wasn't remarkable by any means, plain brown eyes and awkward posture I'd never quite grown out of, and clothes that screamed last-minute thrift store panic, yet something about me intrigued him. Enough that I got the job, and soon I found myself drawn into his world, a glittering cage filled with impossible expectations and quiet manipulations, and slowly, day by day, the version of me I knew began to fade, replaced by routines and rules, by changes so subtle I hardly noticed at first. He sent gifts I hadn't asked for, clothes in muted tones that seemed oddly tailored to my figure, shoes that fit just right, and even makeup palettes and shades I'd never worn but somehow brought out features I hadn't realized I had. And at first I told myself it was just generosity, a rich man's whimsy. But then he began requesting I wear certain things, speak in certain ways, smile less, tilt my head just so. And praise came in small doses, rare and addictive like sugar to a starving child. And I craved it. Craved the look in his eyes when I got it right, craved the quiet approval that made my heart stutter and my thoughts blur. And before long, I found myself standing in front of mirrors, rehearsing how to be what he wanted, how to pose like those perfect little porcelain dolls he kept locked behind glass in his penthouse office, each one dressed immaculately, forever frozen in delicate expressions, their eyes wide and empty. And I should have been terrified, should have run, but there was something hypnotic about it, about him, about the way he could dismantle your will with a glance and rebuild you in his image with a single whispered sentence. And though I told myself I was free, I realized one night, late, alone in my tiny apartment surrounded by dresses I hadn't picked and jewelry I hadn't bought, that I hadn't made a single choice in weeks, that my laughter wasn't mine anymore, that even my silence belonged to him. And the worst part was, I didn't mind, not at first, because being his doll meant being seen, being valued, being wanted in a way I'd never known. And when he finally invited me to his private residence under the guise of a company retreat, I knew it was something more, something final. And I wore the dress he left for me, pale blue with lace trim and matching gloves. And he smiled when he saw me, truly smiled and said, "Perfect," as if I'd finally reached the pinnacle of whatever vision he'd had for me. And he introduced me to the others, the women who'd come before me, who sat still and beautiful in his glass cases, not real, not breathing, just memories turned to mannequins. And I stood there frozen, realizing too late what it meant to be his favorite, what it meant to be chosen. And as he reached out to brush a curl behind my ear with terrifying gentleness, I knew I was on the edge of becoming something no longer entirely human, not by force, but by willing submission to his obsession. And in the end, I had to ask myself if I was okay with that. If the illusion of love, of purpose, of being needed was worth the price of my soul. And somewhere deep down, I already knew the answer because I didn't pull away. I didn't run. I simply let him touch my face like I was his most prized possession and whispered, "Do I make you happy, sir?" And when he nodded, I smiled the way he taught me to. Because when you've been invisible for so long, even being a doll feels like being seen. But the moral hidden beneath layers of satin and stillness is this. No matter how beautiful the box, how soft the cushion, how gentle the hand that places you on the shelf, you are still in a cage if you are not allowed to be real. And love, true love, does not require you to become someone else to be worthy of it. And so I remained, somewhere between real and not, days blending into each other in the soft lighting of Lucien's world, where time moved differently, quietly, and meticulously as if afraid to disturb the rhythm he had created for us, and I learned the way he liked things arranged. The spoons precisely aligned, the music never too loud, the curtains drawn just enough to bathe the room in gold, but never fully open, as if the outside world might crack the illusion he had built. And I found myself adjusting to it all with frightening ease, trading spontaneity for structure, freedom for safety, and gradually even my thoughts stopped feeling like mine, because I began anticipating his preferences before he spoke them, reacting to his moods like a finely tuned instrument, and I started to think maybe this was what love meant, this total immersion into someone else's design, this willingness to be molded so completely that you forgot your original shape. And the more I adapted, the more he adored me, gifting me with rare smiles and quiet praise and the occasional hand lingering too long on my shoulder, and it felt like worship and possession all at once, intoxicating and suffocating in equal measure. And when he finally kissed me, it wasn't romantic. It was calculated, a sealing of fate, a confirmation that I had become what he wanted. And though my heart fluttered, a part of me watched from somewhere else, from the remnants of the girl I used to be, whispering warnings I no longer knew how to heed, and he began taking me to his meetings, sitting me beside him like a symbol of control, and people noticed. They always noticed, but they never said anything because no one questioned Lucien Blackthorne, not even when his assistant stopped speaking unless spoken to, not even when her wardrobe shifted entirely to pastel silence, not even when she began smiling too perfectly, blinking too slowly. And though they looked at me with confusion, even pity, no one reached out, because in the world we lived in, obedience looked a lot like success, and I was shining under his spotlight, a trophy wrapped in silk and silence. And at night he'd brush my hair like a ritual, like a craftsman tending to his creation. And I would sit still for him, always still, because the stiller I became, the more he loved me. And love, after all, was all I had ever wanted, even if it came wrapped in control, even if it demanded my surrender. And the transformation wasn't sudden. It was slow and sweet, like a dream you don't realize has turned into a nightmare until you wake up screaming. And by the time I understood what I had lost, I could no longer remember how to fight for it. And the other women, the ones behind glass, began to feel like sisters, reflections of my possible future, or maybe my fate. And I began talking to them when Lucien wasn't around, whispering secrets and doubts, begging their silent eyes for advice I knew would never come. And the scariest part wasn't the fear of becoming one of them. It was the part of me that already felt like I belonged among them, admired and unmoving, adored but frozen. And Lucien started calling me my doll in private, at first as a joke, then as a habit, then as a name so constant that I began to forget my real one, and I answered to it without thinking, just as I obeyed every unspoken command. And he tested me in small ways, pushing limits gently, teaching me silence in pain, stillness in discomfort, and I passed each test without protest because I wanted to be worthy of him, needed to be perfect, and the mansion, once foreign, began to feel like home. Its corridors memorized, its walls whispering in soft voices that told me to stay, to remain perfect, to never question again. And somewhere along the way, he stopped referring to the outside world altogether, isolating me with care, with luxury, with attentiveness so intense it was almost violent. And I didn't resist because I didn't know how. And slowly he replaced every part of my identity with his design, my hobbies, my opinions, even my laughter, until all that remained was what he loved, what he allowed. And I wore my stillness like a crown, beautiful and tragic. And on the anniversary of the day I joined his company, he gave me a necklace with a tiny gold key, saying it belonged to the cabinet where he kept his most precious things. And he kissed my forehead like a blessing. And I knew he meant to place me there someday, behind the glass, immortalized in beauty and silence. And a part of me was horrified, but a larger part, a deeper, darker part, was flattered, honored even, to be chosen above all others, to be his forever. And it wasn't until I saw the reflection of my eyes in the glass one day, wide, doll-like, empty, that something cracked just slightly, like the faintest fracture in porcelain, and the girl I once was stirred inside me, small and scared, whispering that I was still alive, still real. And it shook me, that thought, because I had come so close to forgetting, to letting her die. And that night I stood before the largest cabinet, the one with the velvet-lined interior and the perfect lighting. And I stared at the empty space clearly made for someone my size. And I knew, truly knew, that it was meant for me, and I had a choice. Stay and be admired, or leave and be forgotten. And the terrifying truth was, I didn't know which fate was worse, because in Lucien's world, even the cages were beautiful, even the prisons came with praise. And the longer I stood there, the more I felt the lines blur between love and possession, between devotion and disappearance. And as I clutched the golden key around my neck, I felt the weight of every choice I had surrendered, and in that moment, I realized something so simple, so painfully obvious. It is not love when you must become less of yourself to be worthy of it. And being adored is not the same as being seen. And though his love was flawless, it was a mirror, not a window. And in it, I saw only the version of me he wanted, never the one I was. And that night, I packed nothing, because I owned nothing that hadn't been chosen for me. And I walked barefoot into the dawn, my feet bleeding, but my heart beating, truly beating for the first time in forever. And the world outside was loud and messy and cruel, but it was mine. And I was real in it, messy and flawed and alive. And though I knew I'd never stop wondering what it would have felt like to stay encased, adored, untouched, I also knew that the price of stillness was too high. And the moral, the heartbeat of this whole story is not about love or obsession or even freedom. It's about remembering who you are before someone convinces you that being loved means becoming someone else. Because no matter how beautiful the doll, no matter how perfect the shelf, your soul was never meant to sit still behind glass. The first days after leaving felt like waking from a long, strange sleep, the kind where you're unsure if the dreams were nightmares or memories. And I wandered the city in a daze, the noises too loud, the people too fast, the colors too sharp. And I felt like I didn't belong anywhere, like a creature carved for display, now stumbling through chaos without a pedestal. And I slept in cheap motels, wrapped in donated clothes that didn't smell like perfume and didn't fit like a sculptor's design. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I looked into a mirror and didn't see a doll. I saw a girl, hollow-eyed but human, afraid but free. And I cried for hours the first night, not because I missed Lucien, but because I missed the certainty, the routine, the illusion of love wrapped so carefully in gold and silence. And healing, I learned, is not a graceful process, but a violent, messy one, where your heart wants to return to what hurt it just because it was quiet there. And every day I fought the urge to go back, to pick up the phone, to wear the dresses, to vanish into beauty again. Because what no one tells you is that even cages made of glass feel like home if they're the only places you've ever been seen. And I found a job eventually. Nothing glamorous, just waitressing at a dim little cafe where the smell of burnt coffee clung to my clothes and no one cared if I smiled or not. And it was ugly and loud and imperfect, but it was mine, and the tips were terrible, but the freedom was priceless. And slowly I began collecting pieces of myself like shards of a broken plate. Sharp and scattered, but still mine. And I started writing again, filling notebooks with thoughts that weren't curated or approved, just raw and jagged. And I met people who didn't know my name from a boardroom or a whisper, people who laughed too loudly and cried too openly and told me I didn't have to be anything but honest. And it terrified me, that level of vulnerability, because Lucien had taught me to mask, to measure, to mold. But these people, these loud, bright, flawed humans, they welcomed the messy parts of me, the angry parts, the unsure parts. And I started to believe little by little that maybe I didn't have to be perfect to be loved. And I went to therapy too, where I sat on uncomfortable chairs and learned uncomfortable truths, where I said his name out loud for the first time without flinching and unpacked the layers of manipulation like peeling skin. And I learned about coercion, about gaslighting, about psychological grooming. And it felt like rewriting my entire story with words I'd never been given before. And sometimes I hated the therapist for telling me it wasn't my fault, because a part of me still clung to the lie that I had chosen it, that I had liked it, that I had wanted to become his doll, because admitting I hadn't meant admitting how deep the violation went. And that truth hurt more than any porcelain shell ever could. And one day, months later, I walked past a toy store, and in the window was a display of ballerina dolls, graceful, pale, smiling. And I stopped staring for so long. The shopkeeper asked if I was all right, and I realized I wasn't crying. I was angry, truly angry, for the first time. because I had been turned into one of those things without my consent and I hadn't even known it. And I wanted to scream at every young girl walking past not to confuse control for care, not to trade autonomy for affection, not to accept a cage just because it was gilded. And I started speaking out, anonymously at first, writing online about my story, about Lucien, about the subtle way power disguises itself as love. And the messages started trickling in, quiet, broken stories from women who had been molded, used, polished, who had smiled through silence and were only now learning how to scream again, and their voices gave me strength. Because healing in isolation is hard, but healing together, even in digital shadows, creates something close to salvation. And still, sometimes I dreamed of him, of his voice, of the way he would look at me like I was a masterpiece, and I would wake up sweating, confused, ashamed, because some parts of me still missed that twisted affection. And I had to forgive those parts, not silence them, because they weren't weak. They were just starved once, starved of love, of validation, of being seen. And Lucien had fed them lies wrapped in sugar, and I had eaten them because I was hungry. And that didn't make me broken, just human. And the more I wrote, the more real I became. And I began to remember my name. Not the one he called me, but the one I chose for myself, full and flawed and alive. And eventually, I changed my number, deleted the last remnants of his world, but I kept the golden key, not as a symbol of bondage, but as a reminder of how far I'd come, of how close I came to vanishing, of how easily love can look like control if you've never seen the real thing. And when I held it, I whispered promises to myself that I would never again shrink to fit someone else's fantasy, never again become beautiful at the cost of my voice, never again smile for a man who only loved me when I was silent. And maybe that was the truest act of rebellion. Not shouting, not raging, but simply existing in all my loud, honest, clumsy glory, without apology, without fear, because I had learned the hardest truth of all, that you cannot be loved properly while pretending to be someone else, and that the world may never adore you like a doll, but it will embrace you like a human. And that is the kind of love that lasts, that heals, that frees. And every step I take away from that glass cabinet is a step back to myself. And every word I write, every breath I take, every moment I choose freedom over perfection, I reclaim what he tried to turn into decoration. And if there is any moral worth engraving on hearts, it is this. Never mistake being chosen for being cherished. Never let someone build you into a statue when you were born to dance. And never forget that real love doesn't ask you to change your shape. It only asks that you be real. But peace, I discovered, doesn't come just from leaving. It comes from staying gone. And that was the hardest part, because even as my days grew brighter and my voice stronger, the past still curled around the edges of my memory like fog that refused to burn away with the morning sun. And it was nearly a year later, when the sky was just starting to hint at spring, that I saw him again. Not in dreams, not in memories, but in real life. Standing across the street from the cafe where I now worked, the morning shift, his coat too crisp for the weather, his eyes exactly as cold and precise as I remembered, and my heart clenched in my chest with a fear so deep it made my knees weak. But what terrified me more was the tiny pulse of longing that followed it, like a bruise remembering the hand that caused it. And he didn't move, just watched, letting the seconds stretch like threads about to snap. And then he turned and disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a silence louder than a scream, and I couldn't focus the rest of the day. Couldn't shake the image of him, still immaculate, still unreadable, still tethered to the part of me that once bowed so willingly to his every whim. And the worst part was, I didn't tell anyone. Not my therapist, not my coworkers, not the new friend who had slowly, carefully begun to hold space for my laughter. I kept it quiet, buried it like contraband, because some part of me still believed he could reach into my life and rearrange it again. And a few days later, the flowers arrived, white orchids in a crystal vase with no note, just like before, just like always. And I stood there staring at them for what felt like hours. My breath caught in my throat, and I wanted to throw them away, to scream, to break the vase and the spell, but instead, I left them there, untouched, a warning to myself that the past had not forgotten me. And the next week, he sent a letter. No return address, of course, just embossed paper and ink that smelled faintly like him. And it wasn't a demand or an apology, but something far more dangerous, an invitation. a request to meet for closure, he wrote, to see how my favorite creation has flourished. And those words, those poisonous, perfectly chosen words, made something inside me fracture again, because he still didn't see me, not as a person, not as a survivor, but as a thing he once made. And I realized then that nothing had changed for him. That while I had been rebuilding, he had been waiting, certain I would one day return to the pedestal he had built in my image. And that was the moment I knew I had to face him, not to surrender, but to end it properly, because ghosts do not rest unless you bury them yourself. And so I agreed, not at his estate or any familiar place, but at a public rooftop bar in the middle of the city where the sun could find us and the sky could watch. And I wore no makeup, no carefully chosen dress, just jeans and a jacket. And when he saw me, he hesitated for the first time, just a flicker, just a beat. And it was enough for me to see it. He hadn't expected this version of me, this uncreated, undrafted, undoll-like girl. And I sat across from him, heartbeat loud but steady, and I let him talk, let him use all the words he was so skilled at shaping. And they were beautiful, dangerous words about regret and misunderstanding, about how he had loved me in the only way he knew how, about how he had never meant to hurt me, and how I had made him feel something he hadn't known he could. And in another life, I might have melted, might have wept, but not this time. Not here, not now. And when he reached for my hand, I pulled it back calmly and said the words I'd rehearsed 1,000 times. You didn't love me, you loved what you could make of me. And his eyes narrowed just slightly, the mask cracking like frost under heat. And I stood then, slow and sure, and I told him I was done, truly done, and that I would not be a doll for him or for anyone else again. And I walked away before he could speak again, because I didn't need to hear it. Didn't need to be drawn back into a spell. And the sunlight hit me as I stepped outside, warming the back of my neck like a blessing. And I exhaled for the first time in what felt like a life. Truly exhaled, because facing him hadn't broken me. It had freed me. And the next day, I told my story under my real name, every detail, every fracture, every twisted lie dressed as devotion. And the world responded, some with disbelief, some with sympathy, but most with resonance, because too many knew what it was to be reshaped, rewritten, repurposed for someone else's vision of beauty. And I began speaking at events, writing more than ever, no longer from the shadows, but from the center of my own story. And women I had never met thanked me for giving language to what they had only ever felt. And I kept the golden key still, but now I wore it on a chain with a charm shaped like an open door, because I had turned the symbol of my silence into one of escape. And I met someone too, not right away, not as a cure, but as a continuation, someone who didn't want to fix me or sculpt me or admire me from a distance, but who listened and asked questions and waited for the messy answers. And he didn't call me perfect, thank God, because I wasn't. And that's what made it real. And for the first time in my life, I was loved for the noise, for the questions, for the courage it took to be imperfect out loud. And some days are still hard. Some nights still bring dreams I'd rather not have. But every time I look in the mirror and see a woman who chose herself over illusion, I feel something like pride. And every time I speak the truth without flinching, I feel something like power. And I know now, truly know, that I was never a doll. I was a girl who forgot her voice, then fought to get it back. And if there is any final note to this story, any truth worth repeating until the world believes it, it is this: love that demands silence is not love at all. And anyone who asks you to shrink yourself to fit their version of perfection is not offering you a life. They're offering you a cage. And the bravest thing you can ever do is walk away from a pedestal you never asked to stand on and reclaim the messy, magnificent truth of who you are. Because you are not a doll. You are not a design. You are not a creation. You are a force, a fire, a voice that deserves to be heard in its truest, loudest form. And the moment you believe that is the moment no one can ever put you back behind glass again.